So starting at the start, I've got Bitwig in front of me. The only two channels I've set up this far is a blank MIDI channel, just with some of the MIDI clips from the track that I can bring in later on. And then the other one is my Moog Sub 37, and that's just a simple MIDI out, audio in. There's nothing in arrangement screen, and that's basically it. The only thing to notice here is I have by default new channels coming in at minus 10 dB, which I'll probably explain later on when it comes to the mix down. Those of you that don't know Bitwig, it's pretty much the same as any other DAW, as they're all pretty much the same. You've got your mixer area here, you've got clips. If you're Ableton users, you'll definitely recognize the clips scene. If I click on a channel, I've got my devices down here, so any VSTs or effects will be dragged into this part. And then if I tab across to the arrangement screen, it's exactly the same as any other DAW. Time going left to right, channels going down here. So I've got a Moog Sub 37 here. There's kind of a reason I use this synth, but it kind of doesn't matter to anyone watching this, I think. I like this synth for the fact that it's really quite limited. It's paraphonic, which means that it's dual monophonic, basically. So it's not quite polyphonic. You can't quite play a chord, but it will allow you to play two notes using two oscillators. And it's kind of my starting point for pretty much everything I do these days. Usually for the bass line notes, because I like playing with all the buttons and dials and everything, I just prefer that as something to go to, basically. So this is the actual sound that I started with. It's a fairly simple, almost saw wave sound, but when it's filtered down, like that, you've got quite a nice subby bass. So I tend to start with the bass line and I'll filter it right down. But I've sort of taken advantage of the whole duophonic side. So if I just initialize this patch and find a blank one for now, that'll do. There we go. So with that basic saw wave, I've got oscillator 1 full blast and oscillator 2 full blast. You'll hear they slightly phase against each other, which is one of the reasons I use this hardware rather than software, because when you're using a soft synth, those two waves, those two oscillators will be perfectly in sync, whereas when you go analog, they're just a little bit out of phase. So if I just hold a note down, you'll hear it phasing slightly. And that's something I love. It just adds a bit of, I don't know, I guess it's kind of a natural sort of sound, and it almost sort of humanizes the sound. So yeah, so I've got two oscillators. I've also got a sub oscillator as well, which again, most VSTs will have. Bring that in. And then I've got some feedback here as well. So if I dial that up. And I've got some multi-drive, dial that up as well. So it's just basically distortion. And then open the filter. There we go. The other thing, as I said, I put it on duo mode, which obviously if you're using a VST or anything, you won't need to do that. But duo mode allows me to play one note and then a second note on top, which will then play in through the two different oscillators. So once we've got that sort of thick, rich sound, if I dial the filter down, I've got my sub bass. Lovely and warm. And then obviously I can open that up. Now with the duophonic, paraphonic, sorry. It's kind of a weird thing, and again, I'm not entirely sure what's going on behind the circuits here, but it seems to be almost vibrating against itself, and I'll give you an example. So if I was to play A and A, we know they're going to be in harmony. Lovely. If I play A and E, then we know that's going to be in harmony, and that sounds fine. But if I play A and C, which you'd expect to be in any major triad, it sounds horrific. And that's kind of one of the things that I love about this synth, is it, or at least this patch that I've done, is that it kind of forces you to think differently and work differently, because things that should work don't work. And I love that restriction. As bizarre as it sounds, I like being forced into doing something sort of slightly outside the box. So starting with the bass line of Borg, it was really a very simple and that's basically it. So once you've developed your bass line notes, and that was my theme throughout the track, was just those simple. Then you start to work on a chord, because I know later on in the track I'm going to want to filter that up and bring in a top line on top of that bass line. And this is where the beauty of the Sub 37 works for me, is that I'm kind of forced to use notes that perhaps I wouldn't normally have used. And I like that for just purely experimenting. So once I've got my first note, like I say, naturally I would go to C, but that just sounds so bad, I'm thrown to E to try that. So with that, I literally, I mean, I can't recreate this moment because it was just purely experimentation, but I ended up then developing that chord sequence, because really that was the only sort of notes I was allowed to play. They just worked so well together that I couldn't not do it, basically. So yeah, so once I've kind of then developed my chords or my bass line notes, what I'll tend to do is I'll record them in manually or write them in a MIDI clip, which I've already got in Bitwig at the moment, so I'll play that in a second. And what I'll do is I'll record at least 3 or 4 rotations of that, again using hardware and particularly analog synths. They will drift a little bit, there'll be something that might not work, you might get a couple of click noises at the beginning of a note and it might not be perfect, so I tend to sort of record 3 or 4 rotations of each one, because sometimes those clicks can work, sometimes they don't. I might need to edit it later. And I know that, as with all of my tracks really at the moment, I know that in the main sort of breakdown area of the track, I know I'm going to have these notes playing, and I'm going to want to basically open up the filter as the notes are playing. So yeah, so I'll crack on and record that. So all I've done here is put in those exact same notes. I then pretended I was good at playing keyboards and put in some little jazzy fingers at the end of that rotation. So if I just play that as is. So yeah, that's essentially the main sort of theme to the track that will underline the whole thing. If I leave that running in a second and run over to the synth, what I'll do is I'll bring the filter down like this. So it's just a low pass filter. And yeah, it kind of just starts with me finding roughly where I can filter down to without filtering out the bass, and just kind of getting rid of the top line notes. So that's what, about 300 Hertz. So once I'm happy with that, that's essentially my bass line. What I could do is just mute the top line notes, but because of this whole paraphonic element to it, it kind of loses a lot of depth and warmth to the sound. So I keep those top line notes in and just filter them out. So yeah, once I'm happy with that, I'll then load up a, not a MIDI channel, an audio channel. And I'll take the input to be Moog Sub 37, record it, and hit record. So as you can see, that's the recording going in. And I'll leave that as a sort of rotation on its own with the filter down. There we go. So it's done one rotation. And you'll hear there's a couple of clicks every now and then, so I'll leave it go through another one, and then I'll start opening the filter manually. And it's really just a case of doing it by hand until I've got one full rotation, totally open filter. There we go. So in there, we've got a bunch of rotations. And even though there's a little bit of latency in the Moog, I like it in there. So I don't ever touch that. And I think that that's kind of part of my whole sort of thought process behind all of my productions at the moment, is that I think sometimes people get so obsessed with everything sounding clean and perfect, we kind of forget that while we can make it clean and perfect, that's not really a very human thing to do. If you go and see a band play and someone's playing guitar, every time they pluck that string or hit the drum or whatever it is they're doing, you're not really hearing the same thing twice every time. So it's not going to be the same amplitude. It's not going to be exactly the same tone. It's not going to be, you know, everything's slightly changing. So that's kind of my way of thinking behind using hardware synths. And to be honest, it doesn't need to be analog for this either. The fact that I'm manually turning that, the filter cutoff, is something that I find just adds a bit of a sort of human element to the track. So if you are using a VST or whatever, then, you know, I'd recommend maybe getting a MIDI controller or something with a CC control dial, and just assign it and record it in as audio, as though you're playing that instrument, and you manually dial in the cutoff as you see fit. And I just think it adds a bit of a sort of a natural sound to the instrument then, and makes it almost more human, because we live in a world of computers. We don't actually have to have the computer do everything for us. So yeah, so I've got that rotation of those chords. What I'll do then is go into the arrangement screen and chuck it in there. You can see just by the waveform alone that it gets louder as I open the filter, which is obviously going to happen. So we'll have to work on that and start leveling it out. It's pretty simple, really. All I do is chuck in a amplitude tool. Every DAW has one. And then if I just play that, we know it's all going to be filtered there, so that's fine. And I think it was the second or third rotation where I start to open the filter now. So if I click on the amplitude to automate it, there you go, you can hear it starting to creep in on us. And it's really just kind of play it by ear at this stage. So all in all, that's about 8 dB different. That's not far off at this stage. So yeah, so I'm just kind of leveling out the amplitude, basically just trying to make it so it's not too loud, but chances are we'll have to come back to that later on when we start arranging the track out. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it for the bass line. The only thing I'll do is, you know, cut it there, for example. Being the OCD person I am, what I'll usually do is have the first rotation colour it yellow, and then the second or third, I think it was this one where I start opening it up, make that orange, and then where I really start ramping it up, make it red, so it's nice and traffic lighty. And I know from past experience that's backwards, but that's the way I've done it. Red means go in my world. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the bass line.